welcome. I'd like to extend a word of thanks to our colleagues, our friends, and the broader Indlulamithi family for joining us today.
Either we mute or we leave.
Welcome again, and thank you especially to the members of the media who are joining us today physically in this venue. But most importantly, I'd like to also welcome those who are joining us from home, who are joining us from Zoom, but also to those who are joining from YouTube as we are live streaming today. Today, we're going to be revealing the Indlulamithi SA Scenarios 2035. Now, why Indlulamithi? Nguni speakers amongst us will know that Indlulamithi is the name for giraffe, and the lesson for that is to look above the trees. So we would like to invite you today to go on this journey with us, to look above the trees towards 2035. My name is Golelwa Kashekatia. I'm going to be the program director for today's program. It's a very short program, and it will begin by an address by our chairperson of our board of trustees. We also have other members of the board who are with us today. And with that said, I'm going to ask Dr. Somadoda Fikeni to come and make the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Golelwa Kashekatia, our brand new project leader for the Indlulamithi. She used to be with Mapungu Boy, and now we have managed to persuade her to be fully focused on this project as we enter some of its most exciting, journeys ahead. First, let me welcome my fellow trustees, welcome the executive members of Indlulamithi, welcome the partners of Indlulamithi, and welcome the people who have been working on this very important project as midwives of the new scenarios. Perhaps more important is really to recognize and thank the media, because in the era of mass digital communication, nothing you say will fly if it is not for the media to take it. We really appreciate that you decided to prioritize this event, because there are so many competing events in the life of a South African. There's a Senzo Meyiwa, there could be a Tabo Bester, there could be a fire somewhere, there could be the latest press conference on something else. We are a newsy country. But what is most important for today, which will go down in history, and coincidentally, we meet on the day when the Berlin Wall fell, which is a moment that defined the end of the Cold War and the start of a unipolar system, which now is on the verge of being recreated into a multipolar system, but its birth seemed to be violent, and geopolitical tensions will tell that. That aside, my remarks are just few, because substantive presentations will be made. The first one, back in 2016, a few individuals decided to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., that they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. and they wanted to do something about being sick and tired. So they decided to create a platform for strategic conversation about the future. That's when Indlulamithi was born. And this, among other things, at the core of it was a scenario work. We do know historically that even in the height of the 80s, scenarios were being built as to what would happen, either in form of books or in form of scenarios commissioned by companies. And that was the basis of imagining a future South Africa when we were in the belly of crisis. And subsequent to that, we've had a number of scenarios in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But the only difference then, people didn't pay much attention to scenarios because the country seemed to be doing well until Indlulamithi came to the picture. But what is most important about Indlulamithi, which launched its first scenario in 2018, when the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was the keynote speaker at the launch of our first scenario work. What has differentiated it is the fact that we did not just launch scenarios and walk away. We decided to track them by having surveys and barometer. We did not just throw them and walk away and they become a one-year wonder. We decided to have economic modeling, which was looking at a range of policies. If you put this policy and that policy, which way would we tilt in the scenarios that we have? Of course, the previous scenarios were dense moves. I guess they were trying to appeal to the youth. Gwara Gwara, Naile Walk, Isi Bourgeois. But this time around, as you will hear when we launch, we decided to look for symbols which have a universal appeal, which cut across age groups, and those are the birds. So in 2019, we had the Chief Justice, the former Chief Justice Mogoeng, who launched, the second review and the barometer reports of the scenarios that we had created. And the following year, we had the Speaker of Parliament. So we've been trying to draw all the key role players in all the three branches of government to come and bless this occasion. And our consultations, we went crisscrossing the country when we're creating the first scenarios, meeting with almost all political parties, big and small, ruling and opposition. We met with NGOs, with civil society. We met with the business sector. And I'm happy to say our scenario work has had such an impact, such that Gauteng used it for its Vision 2030. Different departments, including DPME, made reference to it. Different provinces utilized that work. So it has had an impact. However, major developments occurred when COVID-19 came, and that in itself had a seismic impact across the world and in the country. When July 21 riots occurred and many other things occurred, climate change issues coming to the fore, technological revolution coming to the fore, we've had to now say, when we were seeing indicators drifting beyond Gwara, which was our worst case scenario, we started using some algebraic formulas, Gwara plus. Hence, we then took a decision that let's sit down, let's review these scenarios, taking into account all these major key drivers and major key trends. And hence, we are today launching those scenarios. And we also extended the horizon to 2035 because we felt 2030 was too short a period. And today, we've come to say we are unveiling the work that we've been doing, consulting stakeholders, consulting political leaders from across the political range, consulting scholars and experts, creative artists. And that product today is going to be presented before you. And in presenting this, we are saying, without stealing the thunder from those who will be presenting the actual scenarios, the Springbok win has impacted our national psyche, not just for the sports, but to say what is the ecosystem that makes any institution or organization to be a success. And that in itself is very important as we look at the better scenario, which is the one of the weaver work. As I was jogging some few days ago, as I end, I came across this weaver bird's nest. And I said, how coincidental, a day before we have this talk, after the rains, I just walk into this. It was not on the tree, it was on the road. I hope it is a good omen for this country, which has such a great potential, but which unfortunately is limping from one challenge to the next, which unfortunately is going into 2024 as being one of the politically volatile and uncertain years, which unfortunately has an election on the same year as the US election is taking place. You can't afford to have two crazy moments when politicians are possessed by spirits. But we do know, as I close, that as a country, when we present scenarios, we can make a choice to work towards a better scenario, or we can make a choice of doing nothing and drift towards a worst case scenario. South Africa has seen moments of crisis post-World War II, when the world was drifting away from fascism. South Africa was embracing one in the form of apartheid. So in the 50s, it was a period of crisis. The country, across racial divide, civil society, political formations, business people, sports people met in Kliptown. They came up with what was almost a Magna Carta, the Freedom Charter. We still refer to it in some form. In the 90s, again, when we had the deepest crisis under the state of emergency, mass democratic movement drew people from all over the walks of life and people from business sector and everywhere. Some traveled to Senegal, Dakar, and they forged a new path. So we've been able to pull ourselves from the brink of disaster. Again, a flicker of hope during the World Cup. British media, European media was so scathing and negative. It said this World Cup will never take place here. And they were even saying people should carry bulletproof vests, only to find that it was one of the best World Cups. Why? Because private sector, civil society, NGOs, government worked together. And in an amazing manner, even criminals had a moratorium. They had that patriotic moment after visitors left. That's when they said, where were we? So we look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Prof. And then Maya. Thank you so much, Dr. Fikeni, for those opening remarks to help us frame, the program of today. But before we look towards that future, towards 2035, we felt that it would be important to actually revisit the past. And as Indlulamithi, we've been doing this by measuring, the drift towards any of those 2018 scenarios through the barometer, which is an amazing tool that we've actually also used to create a burning platform for ourselves. So to do that, I'm going to invite Dr. Tara Polza Ngwato, who's going to be presenting the latest barometer results. Now, remember, these are based on the 2030 scenarios so that we can see how far we've come before we start looking towards 2035. Tara, over to you.
Morning, everyone here in the room. Good morning online. So we've heard what the value of scenarios are in highly uncertain times. It's not about predicting the future. It's about providing a platform to have conversations today and plan today in view of what may or may not happen, but also very much to form intentions about what we want to see happen. And what the barometer does, as Leloa just said, it keeps that conversation alive. And the goal is the conversation. So in a situation of times of change, and the barometer really has these three intentions. It reminds us that we should be having a conversation about the country and about the future of the country based on evidence that is presented in a way that is digestible. We have many sectoral interests, just like any complex system. Everyone has their own data that they know about and keep track of, but having conversations across sectors is what is so important for the future. And that is the kind of evidence this barometer tries to pull together. Secondly, it's a reminder to keep perspective, to move beyond quarterly results, beyond annual financials, and beyond a 4-year election cycle, to say, what is the longer term trajectory? That is very much what the scenarios do, but it is also what the barometer does by saying, what are the bigger longitudinal stories that we need to be tracking into the past, but then what does that mean for the future? And finally, the goal is the relationships. It's the conversations, it's the debates, and it's the ability to get beyond that first hurdle of saying, no, I don't agree with you about what's actually real, to say, we can see this. We can see where the country is. We can imagine together where the country is going. Now, how do we act? It is about collective action. So we've already put today's presentations in context for you. Prof. Fikeni, are sort of the timelines of the day. So the barometer that I'm presenting now is that last part here in the box, 2023. We are for the last time presenting the evidence-based picture of the 2030 scenarios. As we then heard already, the insight last year already, in fact, the year before that, was that these scenarios no longer tell enough of the spectrum of what is and could be happening in the country. We weren't able to show that we were already beyond the worst case scenario in many cases. And so this GG plus as a stopgap measure was introduced, but really it meant we needed to develop new scenarios. And that is then the second part of what we're doing today. So we're coming to the end of one trajectory and we are starting out a new one. And then in future years, we will move forward with measuring the new scenarios in different ways. All right. The barometer methodology, very, very briefly, not wanting to spend too much time on it, is is to compile secondary data. So this is not a survey. This is using existing data sets that have been produced by multiple different sources. We have compiled 54 different data points this year. Some previous years it's been 52, 53. This year we have 54. But they come from Stats.SA, from the Auditor General, from the World Bank, many official data sources. They also come from highly reputable and recognized civil society data sources like Afrobarometer, like the HSRC Social Attitude Survey. So the data sources themselves are really beyond reproach. They are used in many, many different sectors to say what is going on in the country. What we've done is we've compiled those. The other thing we've done is we've established cutoff points per scenario for each indicator. So we, for example, have said the percent of the population under the poverty line. This is an important indicator, one of our 54. If we have less than 10% of the population under the poverty line, that means for that particular indicator, we're in the Nailewalk scenario. We're in a positive, enabling, cohesive scenario. If you have 10 to 20%, okay, it's starting to get a bit wonky, but we can actually survive as a more or less divided but functional country. As soon as you get over 30% of your population under the poverty line, you have then reached a seriously challenging, fundamentally, structurally unsound society. And that is what we are then calling the Gwara Gwara scenario. Actually, Gwara Gwara was 20 to 30%, more than 30%. This is then tells us 30 GT plus. So once we started seeing, oh my goodness, we're in 40%, we can't just call this Gwara Gwara anymore. That was one of the things that then initiated saying we need a new set of scenarios. All right. So when you then, for these 54 indicators, for each one of them say, what is this particular data point telling us about the scenario one would be in? GDP growth, but also maternal health. So each one of these, that is what then adds up to this barometer. So which measures have we included? If you count, I haven't listed all 54. Some of these have multiple actual data points in them. But what it does is it gives you a sense of the breadth of the data that is included in this barometer. It also shows us that we have key driving forces.
Huh?
So this is a part of the scenarios design methodology. It's also part of the narratives. You will hear more about key driving forces when we hear about the new scenarios. These were the 2030 ones. And what it does is that if you start from the right-hand side, social inequality are those factors that affect the everyday life of your everyday person. They are your experience. So that is whether you are employed, that is whether you have food on the table, whether you have been able to access education.
Is
there somebody who can maybe mute? Somebody needs to be muted on the Zoom call, please. All right. Thank you. Okay.
The presenter is muted. The presenter is muted.
Please unmute the presenter.
Please unmute the presenter.
Please unmute.
Has been designed, as you can see. It's not about averages. It's not saying which scenario do we land in if we take all of these numbers and find the middle. What we're saying is there are always some aspects in a country that work very well and that are strong and that are stable. There are some that are teetering on the brink, and then there are some that are dysfunctional. And we need to see all of those. And what we're seeing here is that our dysfunction is very much in the daily life, but we have some fairly strong institutions. And then we have slippage, but nonetheless, some hope at the top there. And this is really where we want to focus the conversation today, because that is the forward-looking story. When we now combine, okay, now my clicker has stopped working. Tech team, please. Thank you. When we now combine the three KDFs, the three key driving forces with each other, what is the national overall distribution across scenarios? We see in the large picture here on 2023 that just under 60%, 59% of our indicators are still in Gwara Gwara or GG+. And then we compare that, that's a slight reduction from last year. The question really is, what does that mean? We are also seeing, can I get the clicker? There we go. We are also seeing a slight increase in the yellow, which is the Nailewok, which is the cohesive scenario. What does that mean? So not much of a change in Isibujwa, which is a divided but functional society. And essentially, while we've had an overall reduction in the sort of green, but we are continuing to deepen those indicators that are in GG+. All right, what does this mean? What does it mean year on year? So here is the larger trend for the last 5 years. And I guess the big question is, does this increase in Nailewok and this slight decrease in Gwara Gwara, does that constitute a rebound? What does that mean? So when we look at the actual changes in these indicators year on year, we can start answering that question to some extent, although not yet definitely. As researchers, we always say 2 points does not make a trend. You need 3. So we've had 4 points and now 1 going in a slightly different direction. We don't yet know what that means. But what we're seeing here is a range of indicators that have shifted up since last year. They have moved into a quote unquote better, more stable, more cohesive scenario. What are those indicators? Increased tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. That's great. The others are COVID era recovery. So we have come to a slightly better percentage of our children who are in ECD centers after having had a massive decrease in that during COVID. We have seen a slight improvement in the level of hunger. Really reliable. I mean, you really hope so. It was an unbelievable. It was absolutely horrendous under COVID for a while. So we hope there has been a real improvement, and I believe there's many evidence points that says there has been a real improvement. But on the other hand, we don't have very good data on this year on year. And then finally, we have a really major improvement in school completion rates. So the percentage of young people who started school 12 years ago who actually finished their matric year. They might not have passed matric, but at least they were still in school in grade 12. That again might be a COVID era artifact of having to push through the COVID generation of children. So we're seeing evidence here that some things are getting better, but they might be contextually better and not really a sign of larger underlying changes. Now, when we look at those indicators that have gone down 1 or 2 measures, these are where we are seeing really fundamentals of the country. These are not contextual. So our inequality is growing, if that's even possible. We many years didn't have an estimate of the Gini coefficient, and this year there's a new publication out. It's a World Bank estimate, which has gotten even worse. And of course, South Africa, we always say, oh, we have the highest Gini coefficient in the world. We have the highest coefficient of countries who publish these things. Many don't. But nonetheless, even in that context, it's very disappointing to be continuing to go down that path. We also see decreased business confidence. We see decreased GDP growth, a decreased sense of hope and belief in the country's economic trajectory by the general population, and decreased trust in national government. So these are severe underlying challenges, especially with an election year coming up. All right, but let's look at this in a broader trajectory. If we say over the years, this is the 2022 to 2023 barometer status, but these are the variables, the measures that have actually stayed in the Nailewok cohesive scenario pretty consistently since 2019. So we're not just focusing on what are we constantly getting wrong, but what are we actually quite stably getting right? What can you pull yourself up on? So let's look. And it's divided into the key driving forces. So we have our RRR, so how people feel at the top, then our institutions in the middle, and then health there. That's our social inequality. So we have freedom of speech, and this is recognized by South Africans that we have freedom of speech and we have freedom of civil society association. We must not take this for granted. There have, of course, been many times in South African history when this has not been the case, and there are many countries today where this is severely curtailed and going in the wrong direction. So we have retained this and must continue to retain it. When we look at our institutions, the ability to actually collect tax, this is not something to be taken for granted. It is an incredible enabler of everything else, and it works. We also have more than your global average youth representation in parliament. Again, this is very future-oriented kinds of thinking. When we look at governance stability, this is the Mo Ibrahim Index. So this is an African international assessment of governance on the continent. We are consistently in the top 10 of the continent, and that's not something to just poo-poo about. It is, in fact, something we should take seriously and appreciate. And then when you go globally, look at Freedom House, whether or not you want to take their word for it, they also agree that we have political rights and civil liberties. And then finally, our life expectancy on average has continued to rise year on year, every single year that we've been looking at this. So no matter what else is happening in our health system, somehow it's good enough that people are living longer. And as we know from the Human Development Index, this is one of those apex indicators that says something's happening right if we actually end up having more life. This is a good thing. We've put this one at the bottom here about the grade 12 completion rate that I mentioned, because quite possibly that's a blip. That might be a COVID blip. It might not really be structurally what's going on. All right. Now we have a range of indicators that are in the Isi Bourgeois scenario and that have consistently been in Isi Bourgeois. These could go either way. So in a sense, it's important to focus here and say we have to retain where we are. We cannot slip, but there is the possibility of investing here to increase the stability of the country overall. So just briefly looking for media freedom, public support for. This is not necessarily as high. So the public know we have a free media, but some people are like, well, we don't think the media should be able to report on everything that they want to report on. Many people do believe that. So it's on the cusp. It's not to be taken for granted. Trust, believe in courts. National versus ethnic identity. So here it's about saying, well, what is the national cohesion? We identify more South Africans than as our respective language groups or our respective skin color groups. Perceptions about reconciliation, also on the cusp. Very, very importantly, belief in the democratic dispensation. This is not a completely shared view that democracy is the best way forward. It is something that needs to be carefully guarded as a set of beliefs. And then for the first time this year, we've included a measure that says, what is the trust inequality between high and low income earners? So trust in the institutions. And what we're seeing here is that there is too much of a divide. Is that your high income earners saying, sure, things work, but they work for me. And low income earners are saying our institutions are not functioning. And that is based on real experience. All right, so our policy processes, climate change, land reform, sure, moving along, but very slowly. Our national gender balance in parliament, not as good as it could be. And then our actual media freedom is also a bit more shaky than it was for a long time. And then finally, when we look at particular economic sectors, agriculture not doing as badly as some other economic sectors, but fragile. And then our food access and our tertiary education sector, fragile. Not bad, but fragile. All right. Now, when we look, sorry, gentlemen, what's going on? Can we go back, please? All right. Can we go back, please? Quite a bit further back. We're now in completely, yes, okay. Back. All right, there, the green one. Next one. Thank you. All right, so now again, the longer trend. Since 2019, which have been the biggest losers? Which of these indicators have actually dropped by more than 2 scenarios? So maybe they started in Nailewak, but have now ended up in Guara, or they started in Isi Bourgeois and have now ended up in GG+. And what we're seeing here, unsurprisingly, at the top is electricity provision. I don't think none of us have to say anything about that. But also the political stability of parties. So we haven't yet had major splits in the major parties, but we are, as we all know, moving into an era of coalitions and that there is a lot of movement and instability. the Gini coefficient, as we've already mentioned, and a sense of hope and belief in the country's economic trajectory. So if we look here, in 2019, 52% of South Africans thought that the coming year would be better for them than the last. Last year it was 11, which was right at the very bottom of Ipsos's global survey on confidence. Like, is the country going in the right direction? There's been an interesting little blip in 2023. Ipsos again surveyed just recently, as I'm sure many of you saw. And while 27% thinking that the country's going in the right direction doesn't sound like a lot, it's better than 11, and it's going against the trend of global sentiment. So the rest of the world is continuing to feel worse about their future, whereas South Africa is the only country, I believe, that Ipsos surveyed, which is going in the other direction. So this is an interesting process. But also trust in national government continues to massively decrease. All right, next slide. So does this mean that there's a rebound coming? One of the other things we do every year as Indlulamithi is to run a perception survey. So it's just very important that these are two distinct things. What we've talked about so far is 54 secondary data sets. We simply compile those. We're not asking anybody to answer questions. What we do then do is a perception survey of about 2,000 respondents. And what that then tells us, so this is fairly representative. You've got your men and your women, you've got your provinces represented, you've got your age groups, and it's mostly people in the lower income, which is representative of the actual income distribution of the country. So what do the people say? All right. What we see there is that there's not much shift year on year. We still have most respondents saying that institutional capacity continues to get weaker in their perception. So nobody's saying, okay, the government's pulled its sock up, it's getting better, or civil society is functioning better than it was. We're still seeing a sense of it's getting weaker, but slightly less. So last year, 57%, now it's 50. Okay. Social inequality, it's sort of a bit balanced, right? So you've got sort of third, bit more. But essentially, there's not a sense that we've got a plan, it's turning around, it's going to be better. Very, very, not a sense of hope that there's been a structural change. What we're seeing as well at the bottom there is that the strongest feeling, certainly not reconciliation, is actually resentment. Now, the difference between resistance and resentment is resistance is active, resentment is passive. Resentment is, I don't see a point and I'm going to withdraw into my family, into my community, into my ethnic group, possibly, into my church, whatever it is, into my smaller group, and I'm not going to try to engage to change this. So that is really a big question mark about how we're going to move the country forward. All right. Yay, it's working. Thank you. All right. But again, the question is, have we reached the bottom? Is this actually some sense of rebound? We do ask in our own perception survey, in the past 12 months, did you feel that the country was going in the right direction or the wrong direction? So a very similar question to what Ipsos asks. This year, the majority said some things are going right and some things are going wrong, which is actually a benefit because in the previous years, the majority have said something's going wrong. So there's like a slight uptick there. We're also seeing a question about next year. Do you believe, which scenario do you foresee for the next 12 months? And we see the scenario colors there. The green is Gwara Gwara, Isibujwa in the middle, turquoise, and then yellow as the positive Nailewok scenario. And what we're seeing here is this trajectory where for the past 3 years, the sentiment has been, we're moving closer and closer into Gwara Gwara. This year, there is a slight decrease there. which says there's a slightly higher hope that some of these other scenarios are likely in the near future. Okay. We've also asked, well, if something is going right, so what is the word that describes how you feel? And then is something going right? What is going right? If something's going wrong, what is going wrong? And this is actually the first time we're presenting these findings because they are very pointed and very important. So the one word or phrase that describes how you feel, the most commonly mentioned word is disappointed. By far, you can see. So this automatically gets generated as a word cloud based on the percentage of people who use these words. So out of 2,000 people, you can see. What that means, first of all, you can kind of scan through the other words. It's almost all negative, right? But when we compare, we see disappointed, we see sad, we see worried, much bigger than angry. So there is a sense of we had a hope and it has been disappointed. It is a sort of passive sense, but it is also something that comes from a place of we had a different vision, we had a different expectation. And that expectation is still there somewhere, otherwise you can't be disappointed in it. It's not a complete having given up. So sure, we can quibble about the meaning of these words, but it's a very interesting place to be in an election year when the question is, do I vote at all or not? It's almost less a question about who do I vote for and more a question of do I vote at all? And if this is the emotional state of the country, we're going to have a major challenge with getting people to vote. Now, when we see people asking what an example of something that is going wrong, this is the result. It's mostly load shedding, which we all sort of know, but if you're asking people for that one thing, and this is what it is, more than unemployment, that in and of itself is very interesting because a lot of effort is now being put into compacting around improving the electricity situation. And certainly a lot of metros are on the cusp of having a completely revised electricity situation. So if this is something that can actually be significantly reduced in the next 6 to 12 months, and there are many plans in place to try and achieve that, this will address something that really hurts and concerns people emotionally as well as structurally. Of course, unemployment is absolutely crucial. A lot of concern about corruption, crime, and the economy. But that pattern is important to see. Very, very interestingly then also, when you ask people what is going right, and sure, a lot of people say nothing, right? But what is really coming out is that there is a perception, there is a recognition that there are more job opportunities. A lot of people are directly mentioning the Presidential Employment Initiative, specifically named initiatives across different metros and provinces. Something is happening here that is actually being seen. The other thing that is very commonly mentioned are these social relief of distress grants. So the 350 grant, the unemployment grant, that one. All right. So between those, we also see people saying, oh, but actually we can see the economy getting better. We can see COVID recovery. We can actually see less load shedding, right? So the last couple of months, it's been a bit better than it was. So there is very, very practical sense of uptake. Now, of course, the challenge is that a lot of the job opportunities and the social relief of distress grant are in discussion to be discontinued. What does that then do to this particular story? All right. So now, given that, who will take us forward into the future South Africa as per the possibility of the scenarios, both the ones that we've presented over the last several years and the new ones we're about to hear about? Who has the most hope that it's even possible to go somewhere positive with the country. And every single year we have exactly the same pattern here. This is no change from previous years. When you look at different age groups, the most hopeful are the younger ones. So if you have a larger yellow bar here, a larger percentage saying in the next year we could achieve the Nailewok scenario, we could achieve a functioning socially cohesive South Africa in a year. Who sees that being possible? Under 20s and 20 to 29s. As soon as you get to us old fogies, we've given up. So don't ask us to lead this thing, right? Because we don't think it's possible. So the young people still see it. They still see that this can be achieved. The other finding is that we do tend to focus on the big, rich provinces. So we look at Gauteng, we look to KZN, we look to the Western Cape. But if you look at where the hope is, again, the larger yellow bar, and we look at it compared to the national average, which is all the way at the end there, the total. The places that have more hope are the small provinces. It's the Free State and Limpopo and Mpumalanga and the Northern Cape. So let's not say that they're going to wait around until the big provinces decide what to do and then follow suit. Quite possibly, that is where the change starts. That's maybe where, in fact, there's already some aspects of a better life than what we're seeing in some of the big cities and the richer provinces. Okay. So this is closing out the 2030 scenarios and the measurement thereof. Thank you for the dance. We had a great time together. But a little birdie told me that there's a new story to be told. And we're going to pass it on to the team who did a lot of work to tell us that story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that presentation. And colleagues, I'd like to apologize for all the technical glitches that we've experienced both in the room and also online. We understand that there were some challenges logging onto our Zoom platform, but we're also streaming live on YouTube. So those who wish to move away from the Zoom platform, they can actually stream live on YouTube and also for future reference. But we've been monitoring the questions and we've been trying to respond to some of them. I know there's already questions already directed at Tara on the barometer specifically. Unfortunately, we're a bit, we've lost a bit of time, but I will allow for one round of questions specifically on the barometer. Some of them, Tara, we've addressed them on the demographics and, the sample size and so on. But also if the technical team can ensure that we upload the report onto the chat function, but also it is available on our website right now. So if you visit our website, indlulamithi.org.za, you will find the full barometer result. So I'll take one round of questions from the media participants in this room, and maybe if my colleagues can assist me in monitoring the ones that are on the Zoom platform because they've been coming in. So any questions on the 2033 barometer against the 2030 scenarios? It's quite a mouthful, but I think let's hold this moment while we're saying goodbye to the 2030 scenarios before we get into now the actual, reason why we're here today. Okay, I've noted one. Shall we take maybe 3 hands, Tara, and then we'll close it after that? I've noted 1 hand. Very well. Thanks.
I'll call it the first therapy.
Okay, another one there. Thank you.
Yeah,
and I think someone on the Zoom platform needs to mute themselves. And we've been having a problem there because we can hear you in the room. So those who are joining us on Zoom, please make sure that you are muted. Okay, I'll start as Verial. Thank you.
Ferial Hafaji from the Daily Maverick. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation. If we're so far into GG plus territory, why don't we have civil war or state failure? Is it because we have a healthy social solidarity system in terms of grants, or is it because of people's hope, which is far more intangible? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Ferial. Other question?
Hi, Tara. I just wanted to quickly ask, Tanya Bonani, SABC, sorry. So a lot of the conversation or the theme that I came up across was around this question mark around the rebound. And I wanted to understand if, when you were looking at the data sets from the different institutions, if there was a theme around whether the rebound or these sort of increases took place because of COVID interventions per se, or if it was it was a scenario of, okay, because there was so little activity in that period, that there was sort of no markers of adjustment. Because I know that quite a lot of, streams of income developmentally was sort of put to a grinding halt and readjusted to either facilitate the health crisis or sort of be able to create new social nets where they didn't previously exist in an emergency scenario. So I was just wondering whether any of the data sets maybe spoke into that or reflected that kind of glide, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And then I'll take the last question. They think it's Newsroom Africa.
Thank you very much. It's Zianda Ngobo from Newsroom Africa. Tara, I noted that you spoke about who would lead this process, and younger people obviously have more hope. Were you able to assess what was driving them having so much hope? Has it got to do with politics? Is it because they feel that the SRD grants and the job opportunities, is there a link between the two? Just curious.
Thank you very much for those absolutely excellent questions. Ferial, so the GG plus scenario, all of these scenarios are not absolute scenarios about how bad it can get in the world at large. These are still adapted to the South African situation. And so the GG plus scenario is not a scenario of complete state collapse. I mean, I think there's been lots of debate in the last year or so about, is South Africa going into state failure? State failure is a completely different thing. We don't even have a scenario for that yet. And even the new ones are only very carefully tiptoeing around the possibility of actual state failure. So GG plus is not a failed state in the way in which it's sort of politically defined when you have no legitimate government, right? It's still a legitimate government. It still has institutions. They just don't provide a safe and protective environment for other citizens in everyday life. That doesn't mean that that isn't imaginable. And I think part of what the new scenario intention was to say, we need to start allowing ourselves to imagine that South Africa could just be a completely normal country that can collapse. Because for so many years we said, no, it would never be possible, right? We're too strong, we're the exception. And I think it's about now saying, we don't have a scenario name for that, certainly not in these, in the previous barometer, right? But we shouldn't say that that's impossible. Okay. In terms of the COVID barometer, the COVID rebound, et cetera, I think that's a fascinating question. And I think it's going to take a bit longer to see. You're absolutely right that there is, on the one hand, the sort of underlying economic effects of COVID. Then you've got the measurement problems that everybody just stopped measuring stuff during COVID. And then yes, then let's do this. All right, so COVID, on the one hand, you had your underlying economic, you had your health challenge, then you had your underlying economic challenge, then you had that nobody was measuring what was going on anymore, and then you had the interventions coming into place to try and address some of these.
And that's why we're saying that, you know, the new job opportunities and the social relief of distress grants, those were COVID interventions. The question now becomes, do they become structural interventions? Because in fact, the structural gaps that were raised during COVID were not new, right? So the unemployment challenge, in fact, even the health challenge, the nutrition challenge, those had all been there. We just hadn't put emergency situations in place to address them. And so now seeing so I think really importantly, when you say, what does the barometer data show? The barometer data showed before COVID that we were on a downward trend structurally. And so, yes, COVID might have accelerated or deepened some of that. And maybe this year's rebound is simply coming back to the original structural downward trend. But we won't see whether the COVID era interventions will have a long enough life to actually change some of that underlying structural weakness, irrespective of the COVID response. All right, and then the final point, we didn't have a follow-up about what is making youth hopeful. I mean, I think a lot of other people are asking exactly that question. Elections and really youth organizations need to answer that for themselves, not wait for researchers to say that, but they're very vocal in saying for themselves what they are hopeful about, and I think we should be listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that. We've got one last question, and that will be absolutely the last one, SG. Because you're part of the family, you're not allowed to participate, but we will humor you because you've got the numbers.
Yes, it's more about the question around why is there no South Africa Spring? And here I want to refer to Dr. Mbete's notion of why it is not that way. And in her estimation, she says there is a spring, just that it has followed the apartheid settlement patterns. If we were like Gaza, where there was no distance, South Africa would have long seen that spring. And I think that's a very insightful observation by Estembile Mbete. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think from the Zoom platform as well, there's some comments. I think Fakela confirms actually the sentiments of the 50 plus, but also there's a question from Tanya Abrahamse asking if there's any data on mental health and substance abuse.
Thank you for that question. So that is not one of the indicators that we've included in the barometer to date, but it is in fact one that we'd really like to explore for the future barometer, because again, it is a canary in the gold mine, right? So it is one of the ways in which you can see if there's increasing structural strain in society at large. Not that we don't already see that in many other ways. But again, it's one of those where there's a challenge of having national representative data that gets collected every year. So that's possible, another reason why we don't have it. So if you know of a good data set, please send it through. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, and thanks to everyone who's participated and asked those very piercing questions. And now we're going to move on to the actual reason why we all here, the big reveal of the new scenarios. I noted some questions asking about the way forward, but all of that will be answered in the next few minutes through the next presentations. We unveil, we call it the unveil of the new scenarios. But before going on there, I'd just like to acknowledge Fred Khumalo, who is the lead writer of the longer text of scenarios that you will also have access to. Thank you so much, Fred. Fred is here with us today, and he put it all together. Thank you, Fred. We're so fortunate to have the creatives amongst us, because to make these scenarios resonate, we have to have that creative treatment. Now, without wasting any more time, I'm going to then call upon my colleagues, Naeem Jena and Dr. Yaqub Aba Omar, who are going to be revealing to us the new 2035 scenarios. These were also done through following the same methodology we followed before, which is intuitive logic methodology or approach or school of thought in terms of scenarios built. And, intuition and also rigorous research. And we engaged with a number of people, but over 150 experts, influencers, captains of industry. And that led to actually, first and foremost, establishing the key question, which is what would South Africa look like in 2030? And after that, we developed 26 variables, which are statements about the future. And from those, we then could identify those variables that had the highest impact, but also combined with highest uncertainty, because we are now working with a future that is unknown. So uncertainty and impact are of interest to us, and that led to the key driving forces. Those key driving forces are what then inform the storylines that we are going to be revealing today. Over to you, Dr. Yaqub Aba Omar.
So you're not going to look at a bird like that again. Naeem was so pleased with this slide. He said we should keep it for as long as we can. So I'm going to spoil your fun. Let's make sure this works. Am I supposed to point this in any particular direction? Yeah. There we are, right. So, Khalelwa, thank you very much, our new project leader. We're so pleased to have a firm leadership leading us forward now. She's covered this area. So we're leaving Isibuja, Naile Walk, and Guara. We're going now into the scenarios for 2035. And as Prof. Fikeni has indicated, the kind of issues we had to consider when we're looking at our previous scenarios. And we're sitting around 2021, 2022, doing some deep reflection, asking ourselves, has the world really changed all that much that we need to change our scenarios? And the overwhelming answer was yes. Things had changed. We had to be looking at one obvious impact of COVID, but also the geopolitical rivalry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this led us to then identifying the uncertainties that we had, which are captured in those three key driving forces. And on the basis of that, we said we do need a new set of scenarios. But we're also in touch with scenario practitioners and experts around the world and in South Africa, and they were all revising their kind of starting premises for their scenarios. So on the basis of that, then on these three key drivers, we then said, okay, let's look at the 2035 scenarios. So what we have been doing in the past few months, Fred, Naeem, myself, Khalelwa, we've been presenting to different audiences. We've been testing the scenarios, been trying to get a sense of whether we're on the right track or not. And as Khalelwa said, there is a long version, which has, you can see the influence of the creativity of our creative writer that brings out these things a lot more viscerally and more realistically. So if this sounds not exciting enough, read the long version. There's about 7,000 word long versions behind this as well. But imagine yourself for a moment, a day in 2035. And we have here what we're calling some of the key kind of certainties that things are going to be like this in the future. Amongst that is climate change, the impact. Food security continues being a serious problem, largely related to climate change. Then there's all kinds of other diseases that have been coming in. There's no doubt that COVID-19 has put pandemics center stage. When we had the SARS epidemic before COVID, there was a kind of response, but I think people don't realize that COVID's going to come so quickly, and now we're on the lookout for that. Then there's the whole technology thing. Again, another big certainty that is going to go through all three scenarios we're presenting. And then the shift in global power, economically and possibly politically, towards the East. And then the kind of rivalries that we begin seeing as a result of that, particularly the China-US rivalry. So where does South Africa fit in with all these global shifts that we've been identifying thus far? And to start with then, and you're never going to look at a Hadida again the same way. You're going to, as you know, these are our loudest birds on the continent. Shh. I always say the first word my elder daughter learned or uttered was, ah, because she kept hearing this in the garden outside. Okay, so you know the Hadidas, we call this the recrimination scenario because we're kind of squawking and shrilly going away at each other, blaming each other for what has been done or not done. In the scenario, trust has broken. We're continuing the kind of enclaves that we had in the previous scenario, and the blame game is the national sport. If we're not blaming apartheid, we're blaming the ANC, we're blaming the white people, we're white monopoly capital, etc., etc. But we're not taking responsibility for ourselves and saying we're in charge. We take this forward. The economy sputters along, mining is more mechanized, and then we look at the impact of this. Agriculture, fighting with the weather changes. There's unjust transition to renewable energy, clean water scarce. Women, especially Black women, bear the brunt of poverty and violence. Crime rates continue, and they just remain very high and continue raising. And then unemployment is, in this scenario, about 37%, with youth unemployment continuing to be incredibly high. What does the power and governance sort of situation look like in this kind of scenario? So, we've had the steady erosion as far as political parties are concerned. And I think those of you that watch, especially Afrobarometer and the figures that, and the analysis that Tara was presenting, that, political parties are distrusted by over 70% of the voters. The worrying thing is we're also seeing an erosion of trust of the court. So, and that's just one step away for increased lawlessness. And, when you start talking about failed state, fragile state, etc., these are the kinds of things, the indicators we should be watching for. So the more people start fearing the rule of law and they think they can get away with what they want, then you start worrying. So in this scenario, there's a centrist social democratic coalition that governs South Africa. So we've been careful not to use political party names. For one, because people will say, oh, well, that doesn't describe us. They say, don't blame us for all these things. So we call this a centrist social democratic coalition. The party leaders are backroom deals are always being made about everything. But as far as the population is concerned, they're saying, speed up, do something, implement, we want. And people are beginning to say, reduce the crime, grow the economy, rather than making all kinds of promises. As far as South Africa's situation in the world in this Hadida scenario is concerned, we gain little from the west to east power shifts because we're so weak ourselves. Our state institutions are so weak. We keep having this rhetorical ambivalence, this kind of montaging about 1 minute we're in support of this and next minute we're in support of that and maybe this, maybe that. So no one knows where we stand. So we call this rhetorical ambivalence, and it's really costing us. And so even though, as you saw, the AGOA negotiations, that notwithstanding the best foot that we put as South Africa, there's the jury is still out as far as Washington, D.C. is concerned about the continuation of the benefits. In this scenario, coups continue on the African continent from this period, and AU is faction-driven. As you can see, there isn't that kind of clear leadership that we used to have a decade ago. But some countries' economies grow faster than others on the continent. So Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, Mauritius, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Tanzania have doubled since 2020 by the time we get to 2035. Because of our weaknesses, China is ignoring us, notwithstanding us going and genuflecting to Beijing every time we can, and they're just cutting us out from all the deals into Africa. There's a steady erosion of South Africa's defense capacity, which affects our global standing field in. We don't even have a defense force to worry about. But we come back to this later because there's a kind of we try and bring in nuance into our scenarios. Nothing is black and white with our scenarios. So climate change, as we said, is one of the certainties. It impacts on food security, higher temperatures, impacts on crop yields. We regularly import up to about 75% of our wheat. There are lost opportunities around the jet IP. You know, there's all kinds of promises now, and there's all kinds of plans and implementation plans, etc., but nothing's really happening. Then when the 8 of the 14 coal-fired power stations were shut down in 2024, the number of jobs that were lost were crazy. And I think you know that when we speak of a just transition, you have to have the transition, but it also needs to be just. It has to worry about what's going to happen to the workers directly employed, but also the downstream, the go-go selling the tuck shop, or people depending on the workers that bring in the fat home, etc. Again, there are some positives. So as I said, our scenarios are gray. They're not black and white. And here we're saying, technology is one of those certainties. It's moving ahead. And in some aspects of our work, we begin absorbing that into our society. As far as the economy by 2035 is concerned, slow growth, we're constrained. We've only added 3 million jobs since the early 2020s, despite the population increasing to about 70 million. Half the working population of 44 million is not in need, so not in employment, education, or training. As indicated, unemployment is high, middle class has shrunk, tax base continues to contract. We borrow heavily from the IMF and then the BRICS NDB. National debt, it has just risen every year. So we think we got a problem, as Mnuseno Godongwana mentioned last week, and he said that budget's going to be really bad, and he's warning about the national level of debt. But in this scenario, we just keep increasing that. Our GDP ratio, debt to GDP ratio, 110%. Debt payments is 2 billion rands a day. We haven't got out of the fact of grey listing. At the same time, the kind of silver lining on this cloud is that young people are not idle. They've given up waiting for Pretoria to create jobs. They're just moving on. They're using the technologies to create apps, get into the gig economy, etc. Continuing with the economy, as far as energy and the SOEs are concerned, as you know, the trend is already there, and we're seeing this growing, notwithstanding whatever people feel, of private entities and municipalities procuring their own power. So by the 2030s, over 40% of municipalities become at least partially self-sufficient. Eskom's transmission and distribution units are no longer losing money because private green energy generation uses Eskom's core infrastructure efficiently. So it helps Eskom balance its books as well. Transnet has been recapitalized twice, mainly through loans from and assistance from India, and it's now gone back to where it was functioning before. So some good things happen because of the things that we put in place now. The SAA semi-privatization has shifted to full privatization in 2029. Difficult to believe, I know, even if you look at this week's coverage about the fights going on around the SAA deal. Then as far as the sectors are concerned, large-scale commercial farmers have been long buffeted by climate change. Fruit, sugar, vegetable production has grown steadily despite that, and that's because of technology that has been used in some parts of the farm agriculture industry. Manufacturing and mining has stabilized, is no longer shrinking, but automation and AI has limited job growth in services and the manufacturing sectors. So again, that's another aspect of the just transition that we forget. We often just only think of the energy side, but as you bring in new technologies, as we've seen throughout humanity's history, that always impact on the way production happens. So PGM reserves and deposits of other precious and critical metals are still underexploited because of policy uncertainty and cost of crime mitigation. As I said, mining employs 500,000, but from 2004 to 2035, the mining sector shrinks by about 1% annually. Our competitors are actually coming from the rest of Africa. So you find that Ghana, DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, and Burkina Faso are the ones that are attracting more global mining investment. Okay, then we can go on to the next slide. There we go. As far as education is concerned, we see that in this scenario, the kind of current top echelons getting the best education in the world, it's global standards, whereas the vast majority get a very poor education. Poor school management and discipline. I think by 2024, 1.1 million children started school. Tara had indicated some interesting figures about the numbers were actually in matric, but what's the quality of the education they're getting? How many of them actually pass matric? And then how many of them are able to get into jobs or into tertiary education? And this is actually very similar to the 1994 ratio. So there's no big kind of, the numbers have increased, but in terms of ratios, it's still very much what we had in that period. Health is a big issue in this scenario. We call this the government of national unity that had come together after the 2024 election, explores more robust public-private partnership healthcare provision options so that by 2035, it's being to realize, look, they've got to look at different ways of structuring the public health system. South Africans are sicker. We have the world's largest HIV burden. HIV, TB, diabetes, and other diseases stretch the state health facilities. Many are falling short or failing. And we've had to review the NHI that we had set about implementing this year, this 2024-2025. Okay, and then, sorry, before you get the Hadidas coming in. In conclusion then, the Hadidas come home to roost. Apartheid spatial planning endures throughout this period. The middle class is slowly mixed, but we're not mixing fast enough. Gatekeepers, rent takers, petty power officials, water warlords are controlling the public's access to what's public goods. And that's become a problem because people's impatience is palpable. The buck stops nowhere. And that then refers to the question of the failed state, or the question of like, why do people still not rise up in the way they did? Maybe it'll happen. Maybe there is still hope that things would improve. And that's the point we leave the 2035 according to this scenario. Maybe there's hope at the end of it all. Over to you.
Thank you, Abba. And now we'll move on to the fun scenario. Okay, so the second scenario we are looking at is what we are calling vulture culture, the desperation nation. We all know what vultures are. They love a feast, will settle for scraps, they clean up after everything, everyone is done, but they also fight for what they believe is theirs and fight off other birds, other animals in order to protect what they believe belongs to them. Okay, so a quick kind of summary of this scenario. In this scenario, South Africans are more united than previously, generally against the government, which is our governments at all levels, authoritarian populist coalitions that rule, and national government that has passed new laws that curtail media freedom and harshly regulate civil society. Economic growth has stalled, particularly since around 2029. More than half of our adults are jobless. Official unemployment, all our unemployment figures here are according to the narrow definition. The official unemployment is over 43%, youth unemployment over 60%. 1/3 of South Africans go to bed hungry at least once a week. Organized crime has carved out niches for itself all over the place. The one kind of seeming silver or black lining, will the discovery of gas and oil on the West Coast change things? Well, we'll see. So similar kind of features that we'll look at here as Abba did for the Hadidas scenario. First one being power and governance. So let me just say how we got to this point that you saw in the summary in terms of the power and governance thing. 2024 election was won by a liberal right-of-center coalition, which decided to take a hard line on particular aspects, austerity, fighting crime, etc., which didn't go down too well. The austerity certainly didn't in the kind of conditions we had 11, 12 years ago in South Africa, and poverty and unemployment that we have. The heavy-handed crime seemed to be serving richer people and targeting poor people. Whether that was true or not, that's how it seemed. And so that whole project backfired. The liberal coalition that we had populist parties as hangers-on, in a sense, not part of the coalition, but there to help and play a role when they thought it was useful. By around 2027, they saw the writing on the wall, dropped out from their partners, and decided to campaign on their own on the basis of the massive anger on the streets and among the population for 2029 elections. And in 2029, some of these populist parties won the election, got large percentages in the elections, and after months of horse trading, formed a populist government. That was in 2029. Immediately, in order to secure its place for 2034, parties in the coalition began redistributing resources to their core constituencies and voting blocks in preparation. Particularly educated youth were beneficiaries of this. We also saw then defections from other parties to some of the parties in this populist coalition, defections from all parties, especially after 2031, when gas and oil was discovered, and it was realized that people that were in the coalition would get some benefits out of that. In 2034, last year, they narrowly won again. And so they're now set to continue on the same kind of trajectory. Again, the modus operandi is dishing out tenders and food parcels to their friends, vilifying big business, relentlessly blaming foreigners for everything that goes wrong. We're also finding, apart from national government, that in 4 of our provinces and 3 of our metros, the groups that are coalitions that are running these centers of government are ethnic movements that have been talking about returning to traditional values. They hold the balance of power there. So in general, provinces, municipal and national positions and power trump policy and governance. In terms of how South Africa relates to the global scene, though there's been this kind of eastward shift that we've already spoken about, the West, in a sense, remains vital to South Africa's economy, as it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, from the early 2000s and before, of course. Globally, after COVID in particular, there's been increased protectionism and tariff wars as different countries try to regrow and protect their domestic economies. For South Africa, China remains our main trading partner, but there's lots of imbalances in terms of that trade. Also, that we find that the vultures that we're talking about are not only domestic vultures, they're also foreign vultures. So China and some of our other BRICS partners see great opportunities in vulturing on South Africa. By 2030, talking about BRICS, by 2030, we had already become a minor player in BRICS Plus, which now has close to 24 members. But remember, you might remember that we were one of the original 5 in BRICS 12, 13 years ago. We're no longer on the global scene able to, as we used to say, punch above our weight. Our relations with the AU has also become frosty, especially after some of the big players in the AU last year declared that our election lacked integrity and wasn't free and fair, etc. Although there's now a chance that Africa will have a seat on an expanded UN Security Council, we are nowhere in the running for that. How does climate change affect us? Well, in general, it affects the whole world with temperature increases, ice caps melting, bushfires all over the world, air pollution, etc. Diseases aggravated as a result of climate change as well. We in South Africa have had our first outbreak of dengue fever since 1927. Droughts and unseasonable rainfall, confound everyone, including policymakers, about what to do, and farmers about what to do, because they happen at times that they're not supposed to, causing huge drop in crop yields across Africa and including in South Africa. We unfortunately have been pretty unable to mitigate these problems because of a lack of our infrastructure, no maintenance of our infrastructure, etc. So it's not just the food security issue, but even things like water provision. We're not able to deal with when we've been hit with these things. And there's been an increase of climate refugees coming to South Africa. In terms of our economy now, we used to have, well, we still have, very important laws and policies that were put into place for very good reasons, in order to redress injustices of the past and all of those nice things that we used to say. But they've become, over the past half a decade, tools for self-enrichment. And that, the way in which they've been used in the past half a decade, things like employment equity, etc., has inhibited local investor confidence and deterred foreign investment as well. Our budget deficits widened in the late 2020s and increased in the 2030s. Mineral extraction is now less than it was in 1995. In 2004, some of us might remember, mining attracted 5% of the total global mining investment. Now, or last year, it was sitting at 0.3%. The vast majority of South Africa's wealth remains in white hands. Ironically, by not investing in South Africa in the late 2020s by foreign capital, that actually helped the populist coalition to win the elections in 2029, and then, of course, again in 2034. All is not lost on this front. China and Saudi Arabia are very happy to keep lending to us, our BRICS Plus partners, but those loans are collateralized by South African land, by South African mineral wealth, and by our recent gas and oil discoveries. Hard labor is a good way of describing our economy as it stands now. Unemployment is entrenched, it's systemic, and it's highly racialized. By the beginning of this year, unemployment had hit 44%. Youth unemployment, 63%. Again, the narrow definition. Half of all our unemployed people have never had a formal sector job. 70% of unemployed youth under 35 have had at best what we nicely call work opportunities. The only major employment growth in the past half a decade, or just over half a decade, has been in the government sector. And we now have over 2.5 million people dependent on the public purse, which pays out to these people 40% of the wages across the country. Trade union membership, remember trade unions? They still exist. Trade union membership fell steeply, 100 to 150% in total, as union leaders became co-opted, comfortable with the status quo, both government and business and the relations with them. They have little inclination to address things that their members need, like retrenchments or unemployment, let alone big economic issues that we in the past used to think they would. And union employer collusion has resulted in bodies such as NEDLAC and the CCMA becoming moribund and, in fact, becoming places for employment for people from the elite. Government borrowing and the general economic sense has also led to huge inflation, particularly with regard to food. Food inflation is massive. Prices of basic foodstuffs goes up, skyrockets. Hunger and malnutrition as a result increases. 1/3 of our people now say that they are hungry some or all of the time. Inflation spikes. By the beginning of this year, the cost of living CPI increases exceeded wage increases every year for the past decade. By the beginning of this year, South Africans are effectively 25% poorer than we were in 2020. We are a very unhealthy nation. The NHI One of the things that many of us thought was a great thing in the early 2020s is a mirage. Virtually doesn't exist. It's been tainted by corruption, bad implementation, and resulted in lots of health workers either leaving the country or leaving the profession. We now have 1 doctor per 1,000 people across the board. In rural areas, of course, it's even less. Over 200 billion rands was needed to maintain the health infrastructure in 2030. 5 years on now, the system risks complete collapse. We're beset with pandemics as the rest of the world is, but we spectacularly unable to deal with them. HIV is still a big problem. There are new HIV medications available, but we can't afford them. And then, of course, our government in 2033, 2 years ago, banned what they called foreign funded entities. And so the number of health NGOs that and legally holding government to task also fell away. Our average life expectancy has stalled, dropping below Senegal's now. And our technology has slowed down as well, it seems. In terms of crime, let's speed it up. Crime has become much more sophisticated. One of the few things that's become more sophisticated now, and systemic. It's part of the way in which things work. Whether we talk about construction mafias or protection money, etc. Kidnappings for ransom have increased. The number of murders has increased tremendously. And our judicial system, our criminal justice system is just unable to cope. Those within it that want to cope. 94% of murders, 98% of armed robberies and hijackings result in no convictions. Only 3% of reported rape cases produce jail sentences. That's last year's figures, 2034. So to summarize this, after 2034, that populist coalition has ruthlessly shut down the democratic space. We were already by then still reeling from the 2033 Foreign Interference Act that was passed, which banned prominent NGOs and prevented foreign funding of journalism. All of you would be interested to know here. The SABC, a very important part of our society in general. We don't pay enough attention to it, I think. We do in this scenario. SABC management and board after last year's elections had already become faithful government hounds, barking directives from politicians who always called people in the SABC late at night to give them guidance that, of course, they would provide to us in all 11 of 12 official languages. Our SOE boards are stacked with the ruling coalition's allies. SARS has been weaponized to extract from high net worth individuals. Not all, of course, only those not aligned to the ruling coalition. And South Africans have been leaving in droves. People has become our main export. Even other African professionals who for a while filled skills gaps in our country are leaving because the situation is so bad in general and xenophobia has increased. So life is generally, for ordinary South Africans, pretty difficult in vulture culture nation. The gas and oil that was discovered promised some salvation, but for whom is the question? Well, the vultures, it seems, got there first. So just a pause as we consider this scenario. Let's move on then to the third one. The third scenario is what we call weaver work, the cooperation nation. Now, you might know the Kalahari social weavers. I'm sure all of us have seen those Cape weavers. Some of us in our gardens, some of us in the parks that we take a walk around. Those pretty yellow birds where the males build a nest and the female comes and inspects and decides whether she wants to stay. And if she decides she doesn't want to stay, the poor guy has to take it apart and rebuild it. The Kalahari social weavers are a little different. They build their nests cooperatively. Hundreds of birds building a huge nest. And each nest hosts around 100 families, or up to 100 families in each nest. There are records of some of these nests lasting up to 199 years. And so they're multi-generational, they're sustainable, they're resilient, and they put together cooperatively and maintained cooperatively. So a very interesting bird, this Kalahari social weaver, even though it lives out in the desert. Right, so in this scenario, from the mid-2020s, what we found was, of course, South Africa in mid-2020s wasn't a failed state or even a failing state. Some might say a bit fragile, but whatever. Whatever the case is, what really happened was that people were just getting fed up. Things were not happening right. Some of you who were around mid-2020s, early 2020s know what that means. Things were not happening right. Things were going badly. In 2026, economic growth had increased quite substantially. And that was because of a number of things that were put into place from the early 2020s in terms of structural reform, began delivering in 2026. But people didn't see the benefit of economic growth. You can talk about 5% economic growth, but if it doesn't improve employment and doesn't improve social delivery, it really means nothing. And South Africans became, well, khatfal. By the end of 2026, 2027, people began taking to the streets, protests. I mean, we already were the protest capital of the world. Protests all over the country on all kinds of issues, local, provincial, national issues. Social movements began to mobilize, seeing the anger of the people. NGOs got on board as well. And we found this whole kind of new rolling mass action type thing happening in the late 2020s. Artists, creatives, as we might call them, also began to plug in to this this protest culture of that period. We then found religious people begin to lead marches, and by 2029, 2030, a strong interfaith alliance had formed. All of this, in a sense, created a feeling among people, number one, that citizens had to do things for themselves. We needed an active citizenry because government and big business wasn't going to do it for us. And secondly, the khatfalness was a general sense across rural, urban, across gender, across rich and poor as well, unless you are super rich, across all kinds of barriers that existed, across religion. And so the khatfalness became a way in which people kind of became united. The anger was channeled into creativity. Big business first saw the dangers and opportunities, began to work with some civil society organizations to create opportunities, grow the informal sector. And before the 2029 election, that sense was also felt by government. Our unemployment this year is 18%, youth unemployment 35%. I think I spoke a bit too much with the summary, but this is where we. So in terms of power and governance, so by 2029, with all of the anger on the streets, the new coalition that took power in 2029 came in on the platform of listening to the people. This was the slogan, and this was what it seemed they were determined to do. They began to set up cooperative structures. First with civil society to look at, to address some of those grievances. And then in order to address things more concretely, a kind of three-way cooperative structures that were set up government, civil society, and the private sector. After three of the major parties from the 2029 election, their votes had increased tremendously. Smaller parties began to fall by the wayside. And those three parties then signed what they called a Concord Agreement that became the basis for what seems now, 1 year later, 1.5 years later, now at the end of 2035, seems to be working. A stable and focused government that's determined to end corruption, reduce crime, and has also, it seems, begun to convince the world that South Africa is worth investing in and worth relying on. It also seems now that next year's municipal elections, 2036, parties from the Concord Alliance will win in many of the metros and municipalities as well. In terms of the global scene, from 2024, we've been battling to do this, and it seems that we've managed to balance our diplomatic non-alignment. You remember when that war broke out in Europe, we talked about non-alignment. We managed to balance our non-alignment and our economic interests between BRICS plus partners, between Africa and our traditional Western trading partners. Odd to talk about Western and traditional in the same sentence. BRICS Plus was also leveraged by its various members, particularly the Global South members, to strengthen various regional pacts. For us, what's important here was the African Continental Free Trade Area that benefited then from BRICS Plus and benefited South Africa, of course. No great surprise, the US dollar remains the largest global reserve currency, but BRICS Plus members have increasingly been trading between themselves in their own currencies. And so changing to some extent that kind of balance. Those members of BRICS Plus have also been pushing, particularly the Global South members among them, to reform global institutions, something South Africa has been talking about, well, from the late 1990s, I think. Reform global institutions, including the Security Council, despite, two of the members of BRICS Plus are also permanent members of the Security Council or non-elected members, despite their hesitance from Russia and China. That won the day, that kind of argument. After BRICS, South Africa also turned its attention to IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and IPSA, Indian, Brazil, South Africa, and gained economic benefits from strengthening those. With African support and with deeper ties that we've had over the past 7-8 years with ASEAN countries and some of our Middle East allies, this has all cemented us as a front runner for the permanent seat, African permanent seat at the UN Security Council. At the same time that all of these nice things have been happening, we found that in Europe and the US, there's been lots of kind of ructions internally, embroiled in internal political battles, particularly with the rise of the right wing. Some of you might remember there's a guy called Trump in the US a decade and a half ago, and all kinds of right-wingers who started to come into government from the late 2010s, early 2020s. Now that is the mainstream in politics in this part of the world. Okay. In terms of the climate change issue, climate change, of course, has had huge impacts across the world and huge impacts on food security, including in South Africa, forcing us to increase our cereal and grain imports. But South Africa, as part of the African Union, spearheaded a program of food security across the continent, which means that there was a division among the states of the AU, member states of the AU, leveraging different countries' agricultural and horticultural strengths so that you grow this, I grow that, and we can ensure that between us, we have food security. So an interesting fact, by the early 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, 60% of agricultural land in Africa was fallow. Now that has decreased to 40%. That other 20% is being used productively and effectively. Within South Africa, government has enforced policies around sustainable water use. However, water demand, especially in the western parts of the country, have exceeded supply by 40%. Average rainfall has shrunk there even further, which makes these policies even more important. By 5 years ago, beginning of this decade, South Africa was losing 50% of our fresh water, mainly because of our badly maintained infrastructure. That started to change from around 2031 or so, with more investment into the infrastructure. Government has also developed partnerships with the agricultural research institutes and universities to develop new strains of grains that might help us with our food security and reduce the amount that we need to import, particularly maize and wheat. So globally, COVID-19 accelerated deglobalization, encouraged protectionist policies all over the world. Trade as a percentage of GDP kept declining. South Africa in general followed these trends. But what we also did was enter long-term multi-country trade pacts. And in terms of that approach, we particularly encouraged the division of labor within the African Continental Free Trade Area to ensure a supply of critical goods within the continent. We also improved and gave focus to our domestic pharmaceutical and medical equipment manufacturing. FDI flows propels the most sustained period of economic growth in South Africa over the past 4 or 5 years since the early 2000s. Also, better access to fast, cheap internet has encouraged creativity, the gig economy, all of those things that allow people to work on their own and not necessarily employed by big business. The construction boom that kind of began in the late 2020s has now extended to things like social housing, for example. Urbanization and rural-urban migration has slowed as there's been more investment in the rural areas and in agriculture. There's also been a strong focus, particularly with that late 2020s kind of mood of people doing things for themselves, etc. A strong focus both by government and business on the informal sector. And so we've now changed somewhat in terms of how our proportion looks in terms of those people who are wage employed compared to those who are informally employed to those who are unemployed. So, you know, in 2022, that percentage for us was 50% wage employed, 16% informal employed, and 34% unemployed. The global norm for industrializing countries was 45-45-10. We're now closer to that norm. We're now 44% employed, 38% in the informal sector, and 18% unemployed. Clearly, we need to do more on the unemployed side. We need to do more in growing the informal sector, but we've come a long way over the past 12 or 13 years. Oh, reverse migration has become a big phenomenon in the past half a decade, with South Africans who had fled, now returning, and the economic benefits that accrue to us with them coming back with all of that stuff. In terms of energy and SOEs, the 2024 government that we had elected shored up Eskom, again, following through on some of the policies that had been put into place from the early 2020s and accelerated private provision of power. Municipalities and companies and households were allowed to generate more power, and that also fed into the national grid. By 2034, earlier than scheduled, we closed down Kendal, Letabo, and Maimba coal stations. Earlier this year, by the middle of this year, also Tutuka. The more efficient Kusile and Medupi are still running. They've been modified to minimize environmental damage. They're scheduled to close in 2060, but there's expectations that that will happen earlier as well. With the help of the private sector, Transnet's free fall was arrested through recapitalization. There's been a steep drop in crime since 2030, and our tourism has been increasing. The tourism contribution to the GDP has increased. The creative sector's contribution to the GDP has increased substantially. From 2020, it was less than, well, let's say before COVID. 2020, before COVID, it was less than 2%. It's now at 4%, almost having or more than doubled, and has created hundreds of thousands of new jobs directly and indirectly. So what we see in the economy in the past half a decade or so is that the managerial and HR capacities of the corporate sector has been combined with the vision and heft of the state. And this has helped, in a sense, to pull South Africa out of the trap of low investment, low growth that we previously saw. The government from 2029 also bolstered investigative and intelligence gathering capacities within the state, put into place a new Scorpions, as they've been called. That's not the real name. But some of us old, what did you say? Old fogies still have long memories. And new courts have been established to deal with financial crimes. This has changed not only the criminal justice sector and how crime is dealt with, but also the confidence in the country in general. By the late 2020s, what we also saw was civil society began to use this, which is not a new thing in South Africa, volunteerism. Firstly, of course, to staff civil society organizations, very importantly, but also projects around things like rural development, all kinds of clinics and all kinds of things. That volunteerism then, Parliament, after the 2029 Parliament, jumped on that bandwagon and decided it was a good idea. And in 2031, passed the National Youth Service Act. In terms of this, then it was non-military and also non-mandatory. But the way that it was implemented pulled in young people from across the board, including from richer families, in order to create this kind of new development. Many corporates now are on board with it. In fact, many corporates now, when they employ people, they look for YNS on their CVs before deciding whether to employ them. And so we've seen that this YNS has been creating also this exchange between urban, rural, rich, poor, etc. And new skills are being imparted through this. And I'm being told that I have to, in service of the nation, I should end my presentation. Health is getting better, but slowly. I mean, lots of self-imposed problems like obesity, overweight, smoking, alcohol abuse, etc., which government is trying to deal with, but really many of us are our own big problems. Let me end on this point. So, what we see now and over the past decade or so is that our countries and the government's success by this year, has lain particularly in the manner in which we've managed to fuse the power, capital, and the vast reach of the state with the managerial expertise and systems of the private sector, with the legitimacy and embeddedness of civil society, to provide these benefits in economy, society, and nation building. So this kind of triangular cooperative thing that we had. So we had 7 lean years, becoming biblical at the end of this, 7 lean years from 2021 to 2028, and then 7 fat years from 2028 until this year. It required this kind of cooperation between strong, assertive civil society, a more active citizenry, and a political elite that was willing to listen, to find common ground, and work through the problems with the citizenry. There's great hope that the elections next year, local government elections, will finally see a major transformation at that level of government and service delivery as well. Many South Africans now believe that next year will be South Africa's best year ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our team. And if you can listen to those weaver birds, I think they sound lovely. However, during our presentations, when we were preparing for this, a lot of participants complained that even the sound of those weaver birds was not encouraging because they were so traumatized by the hadidas and also the vultures. We try to put the weavers at the end so that we can leave you on a hopeful note. But the reality is that if you look at Tara's presentation, the starting point was Gwara with GG+. So that's the reality. We're not in the business of writing a scenario that we wish for, but it's actually on our reality. However, the Weaver Nation is actually also possible, but it will require a whole lot of work. We've been monitoring the comments on the Zoom platform, but also will allow for a Q&A session with media. It's going to be short because we're supposed to be finishing at 12, and as you can see, it's past 12 now. And we'll take a round of questions from media, and I know they'll have opportunities. Some have scheduled interviews with some of our members, so we will keep it short in terms of this session now. We're also mindful of those who are joining us from home because it has been a long morning for them. So Abba, maybe if you can also move to the front because we're going to have to answer some of the questions. Yes. Who would like to go first? Okay, I'm going to take them one by one because we don't want to take too long. And again, you start with your name so that those at home can hear who is speaking.
Hi, Kanya Bonani again, SABC. Just a quick question around the 35 scenarios. Is there any sort of indication regarding the reworking of how the nation is formed? So in this essence, I really want to ask the question, is semigration or internal migration considered as a factor in how these three scenarios that have just been outlined, play out? Thanks.
And then the gentleman next to her.
Okay. My name is Eric Naki from the Citizen newspaper. I'm interested to know, in your scenarios, did you ever have a situation where those who left South Africa before 94, because we've been talking about skills flight of some white people who went to Australia because they feared the black rule. Are they likely to come back in your scenarios? And what is it that they are bringing if you ever reach that stage? Thank you.
Is there a third question before I move on to the participants online? There's lots of questions from Zoom. Okay, I'll take the last one from the room.
Hi, my name is Velim Tiane. I'm with the SABC News Research. With regards to her data scenario, there is a mentioning of South Africa lagging behind in terms of investment, being leapfrogged by some African states. And my question is, did you consider what could be those sectors of economy in those African states that contribute to that massive growth that is painted in that scenario? And secondly, in terms of South Africa, in the very same scenario, what are those sectors that crippling the growth of the economy in that scenario? Thank you.
Colleagues, I'm sure you've organized yourselves in terms of who responds to what, or should we follow the... Okay, there's one last one, okay, from the floor before. We'll follow the pattern, how we presented, yeah.
Hi, Maswili from the SABC. In terms of your scenarios, I don't think I heard about the migration problems that we have in the country right now, as to by 2035 or so, how it will look like. Are we likely to have a Kamala Harris president or deputy president in the country, if you know what I mean? And yeah, how does it look like? Are the rural South Africans and township South Africans going to claim back their spaza shops? How does it look like?
Thank you for that. So that is the single round we're going to take from media, and then the rest we'll deal with during the media engagements and interviews that are going to be taking place over the next few days. Abba?
So they call me the pretty face of the scenarios project. So I deal with all the easy questions, and the tough ones I leave to Naeem. But I think even Khalilwa may be able to contribute to some of the questions as well. I think the question about the reimagining of the nation, I think is a very important one. I mean, in some of the discussions we've been having, and I'm hoping that, as I indicated, there's been lots and lots and lots of presentations and discussions, and we try and absorb them as we're going in. So in the presentations, you've got to almost like choose what do we highlight. But an interesting question was the same one about the reimagining of the nation, and where people are saying that, look, those very people that have come into South Africa over this month, last year, past 5 years, decades, in the 2035 scenarios, their children will be voting. And what choices will they be making? Will they be integrated into a South African nation, etc.? And it's those moments that I've become aware of myself. My father was born in South Africa. My mother came from India. As far as I'm concerned, I am South African. And you're going to have this situation with the Somalis and everyone else who feel that they're South African, they belong to the nation, and they want to be part of the whole process. We're already seeing this, for example, in Lodium, where a large group of Pakistani traders wanted to put up their own candidate at the local government election. So I think these are dynamics that we need to understand and see how we're going forward as to what do we mean by the South African nation going forward. I think those of us that want to be the kind of right-wing birthists, as they call it in the US, who feel that if you're not born in South Africa, therefore you're not South African, as they try to argue about Barack Obama. I think we need to remember that there are lots of different ways that a nation is constituted and comes together. For me, the fundamental point, it's a personal view, but I think by and large, South Africans seem to say that the Constitution is what defines us. We speak different languages, different foods, etc., different styles and that kind of thing. We're united largely by our geography and our constitution. And there's a whole lot of other characteristics. We're wonderful about the Springboks when they win. We were ignoring Proteas until now when they started doing better at the World Cup in India, etc., etc. So I think it's going to be what some writers around national identity call a movable feast. It's going to be defined and redefined as a South African nation. There's nothing like that stays together. In the scenarios, especially and I'll leave Naeem to talk about the Weaver scenario and people coming back into the country. Hadi does so as far as other countries attracting investment, we kind of focus a lot on the mining industry and the mining sector. But we can already see that in a number of other areas. So if you look at Kenya, in terms of adaptation to AI and IT, it's a lot faster and nimble than we are. Even though and I said not even though, but sometimes the fact that we have such huge behemoths, huge concentration of big companies in each sector. So in each sector, whether it's banking, we'll have 3, 4, or in other sectors. So Kenya has managed to get, and I suppose a lot of other African countries managed to get a lot more of the gig economy stuff. The president himself calls himself a hustler president. They kind of they know how to do it. They kind of get going and things like that. So we focus a lot on the mining sector because of it remains the backbone of South Africa's industry alongside agriculture, obviously, and then we're comparing it against that. And the migration thing, I've spoken to that. Maybe Naeem can handle the others. Naeem can handle the tough ones.
No, you did the tough ones already. My former colleague, Kanya, the internal migration. So let me just say this, I think it's been said already, but in the long versions, the text narrative, each of these three scenarios is about 7,000 words. So there's a lot of detail that goes into that. In different iterations of the long version, we had, in some of those iterations, a whole section on the migration, which included migration from outside as well as internal migration. Those on the drafting committee will remember. But I don't think that a section on migration exists anymore. We've spread it out in different ways. So on your question, Kanya, the internal migration. So there's stuff around rural, urban, at least in two of the three scenarios. I think maybe in all three. There's also this little additional thing in the vulture scenario. I didn't mention it for some reason, but in the vulture scenario, with all of the semigration taking place, Western Cape wants to secede, by the way. So yes, so it is kind of taken into the greater focus is on the urban rural thing, because we think that that's a bigger challenge, not so much on that kind of Joburg to Cape Town kind of thing. The issue of reverse migration, we don't specify even in the longer version about whether this is people who left pre-94 or post-94. And I don't think we want to. We just, in the Weaver scenario, we just leave it open, saying people who had previously migrated are now returning. I know there are people in this room and online who might want to say that those who left before 94, maybe we don't want them back. But we're not making any judgment calls. Yeah, that's it.
Tara, would you like to add something maybe from the, I know Prof wants to come in there, but just to add to Naeem about the migration. I think in the vouchers also, there's also a paragraph, a reflection on how even those who before who would have migrated to South Africa also start wondering if this is actually a desired destination. So it is nuanced and it appears in many ways, but it definitely in the vouchers, also migrants start thinking this is not our preferred destination. Prof, I know you want to come in there before we move on to the Zoom participants.
Thank you very much. I do think that on this very emotive issue of migration, we generally do not have much of consensus. And I've had a fair amount of exposure to some of the policy discussions where different stakeholders are in there. The issue generally is not whether you accept migrants or not, but whether it is acceptable to have 70% of ownership of spazas, which means 90-something% is left out. Migration works better when you balance national interest with your international obligations and Pan-African obligations. But if it only speaks to the sensitivity about immigrants, but not migrants from within the country, you end up, as in Europe, with right-wing governments which have taken over using this issue, because well-meaning progressive people don't want to touch it and balance it. Trump would not have been a president in the US if liberals had stood up and managed the issue to say, how do you balance national interest and immigration? I use one simple example. We have grammar for when people are hysterical about international migrants. It's called xenophobia. We have grammar for when people are irrationally against fellow Africans. It's called Afrophobia. Do we have a phobia when people or companies do not want South Africans? And say, for my farm, for my restaurant, I don't want a South African. That's where ordinary people on the ground are saying, you are not listening to us. We are not saying we're against, we could not have married people who are coming in stayed with them. But when you begin to feel marginalized in a tough economic situation, and everybody, when you want to even finish a sentence, they cut you and say, no, no, it looks like you're about to be xenophobic. There's nothing xenophobic by saying, in a situation of unemployment, how do we balance national interest and those of immigrants? But it is xenophobic against South Africa. It's phobic against South Africans to say, let's not even talk about those things. And it's going to explode in our faces if we don't make that balance of saying, live and let live. Right-wingers are rising. They're articulating this thing. Mainstream progressives are saying, don't even mention the word. That's the only thing that I think we should begin to grapple with. Secondly, when you say you do not know how many people have moved in, they are not documented, forget about any crime intelligence. It's as simple as that. In Botswana is the same. In Switzerland is the same. If you say, trace this person and the police, who have met with the police, it's not a theoretical construct. They say, we can't talk about this thing because they say it's politically sensitive. But we can't trace people who have taken these things if they are not documented. And that is a global security issue. It's as simple as that. Same as cards which are not recorded. You go to Marabastad or township, person is carrying 1,000 SIM cards. They are not recorded at the time when you say crime has moved into the internet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. And I think what Prof. Fikeni brings focus to is this issue that we always speak about in Indlulamithi, about our silent disagreements as a nation. We carefully manage that. We even provide and create names for certain issues that are difficult, where we cannot find each other. So that's another aspect of, of who we are as South Africa. Now, moving on to the questions on from the Zoom platform, I'll start with Mpho Tladi, who is asking how Johannesburg can leverage the perspectives within coalitions to respond to our governance issues. And several questions that are coming from Zoom are about local and provincial governance, really, which is quite interesting. And then after that, we've got a question on climate change. Well, some of them, Abba and Naeem, are really about people who want to connect with us, and we will be providing them with email addresses on climate change. But then we have Lupumlo Tinta, who also speaks to, municipalities. Again, another question that speaks to politics at the local level. And he says, what is the current rate of self-sufficiency of municipalities, and what would be the major factors contributing to the 30 to 40% in 2035 Hadida scenario? And then again, we have Ivy, who's talking about how the original scenarios, I think maybe Tara will take this one, how the original scenarios moved from 9 provinces down to 8, maybe Abba is, or a combination of Tara to 8, and if she remembers correctly, and you're quite correct, Ivy, there was that in the original scenarios, and now wondering how the new scenarios, if they indicate a similar change, and I think there is something to that effect where 2 provinces are concerned. And then lastly, which is one that maybe I'll take at the end, or any one of us, really about what needs to happen now to prevent the deterioration into GG or GG plus situation, which we've actually even moved on from. So I'll take that as the questions from Zoom, and again, if the colleagues can respond again in the same order, and then we will close after that.
So one of my gigs is to do presentations on scenarios, and So I was doing this at the Wits School of Governance, and there's this one group that are like coming out with some really sharp questions. And I was telling the lecturer, wow, these are really good questions. Then the lecturer said, no, those are actually the assignment that that group has. So I'm looking at some of these questions and I think, yo. So maybe that's your assignment that you have to do. But I think at a very general level, it's important to emphasize how we hope these scenarios are used. We saw this happening very successfully with the first round of scenarios that we launched in 2018, that we like presenting the scenarios, not so much as, oh, come in and fill the gap after the CEO's opening remarks and before tea at a strat planning session. But what we like is for people to workshop these scenarios. So, you look at your organization, you look at the strategies that it has, whether it's church, local, town, metro, national departments through to cabinet, and say, okay, if this scenario were to occur, do we have the right responses in place? Is our strategy robust enough? It's what we call in the lingo, wind tunneling your strategy. And then, especially with the third scenario, if you feel that the Weaver scenario is good, but maybe let's ask the question, how could it be better? If we feel that we could reach it, what do we think we need to do to reach it, but then go beyond that? So my broad answer to the question about municipalities and deterioration, etc., would be that. I think the Indlulamithi website would have both the presentation and in due course, keep your fingers crossed, sooner rather than later that the long version will be ready. As you can imagine, as you get these different inputs, you think, okay, we need to put this in, etc. We need to draw the line at some point. So we'll hope to have that. I think the question that was being raised about self-sufficiency of municipalities and things, I think that's an important question that maybe it should be workshopped, because if we had the money, if the Indlulamithi Trust had enough funding, I would love to see a situation where we roll out these scenarios to all the government departments, provinces, local governments, to start working through their responses to the scenarios. So that's a plug to invite us, and maybe at a small fee, we can facilitate that workshop. This is what I call upward delegation from Naeem to me. So on the provinces, as Naeem indicated that he didn't have time to really go into it, but in the vulture scenario, the kind of moves that we're seeing currently with the Western Cape wanting to declare UDI, we worked through that scenario and we teased that out, as well as with KwaZulu-Natal wanting to secede from the mother body of South Africa. So when you're reading that, keep that in mind, that there is a possibility. And that comes again back to the question of the nation. If you're having these kind of secessionist movements away, who is the South African nation after all that? Are we going to allow people to just break away as it goes? Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleagues. And thank you, Abba. Thank you, Naeem. Thank you, Tara, for that. And just to close off, I'm going to borrow from one of the comments on the Zoom, which is actually very hopeful. And here's Sia Morris. I hope you don't mind me sharing, because I think it's quite pointed in terms of what we're trying to do here. Sia refers to the young population that we have as a nation, and says, if handled well, this may just prove to be the biggest national competitive advantage and silver lining that we need. I do fear, though, however, that the approach in terms of how we handle our education system and how that is managed, this youthful potential and opportunity may just be the country's own undoing. And I think that's something that is captured quite clearly in the Weaver scenario, where we see the potential of youth. It's, if you read closely the Weaver scenario, it's that youthful energy that drives us towards that. Yes, it is triggered by this hurtful nation, but also combined with that is the creative industries, wherein we see social movements and protest culture that resembles that of the 1980s. And you add to that the faith-based movements. We do remember seeing the Bishop Tutus there at the forefront, young people, protest poetry, art, and so on. So there is potential there. However, again, I would like to remind us all that we are coming from the Gwara and GG plus nation. So with that said, I mean, as a way forward, we continue to engage. We will have several media engagements with some of you in the room, and also in the next few days, I know already our team has already scheduled those. We are continuing with our stakeholder engagements like we did before, wherein we engaged with all the political parties that are represented in Parliament, but also to make sure that we also engage with the number one citizen, which is the President and Cabinet. And with that said, I'd like to then thank Professor Harry Dugmore, who's joining us from Australia, who actually worked very closely with us in tightening the scripts that Fred had so eloquently put together. And Professor Dugmore, we haven't forgotten you. We know it's probably some ungodly hour there in Australia, but Professor Dugmore was also part of the initial team and is still with us, even though he's so far away. And I'd also like to thank Fred again for your creative input and getting us to think about these vultures and so on. I mean, we went through various processes of trying to select the correct animals. We're from hyenas and so on, and many debates afterwards. We settled on the birds. I'd like to thank our research team, led by the pretty face Yakub Abaoma, but also with the very capable Naeem, who drives the process and is up at night at ungodly hours, making sure that we get the scripts and the presentations right. Tara, from the beginning, you've been there designing and actually releasing the barometer results, and we do hope that we will continue now with the new barometer that will speak to the 2035 scenarios. And we'd like to thank our Board of Trustees under the leadership of Professor Somadoda Fikeni, very supportive board, very powerful, influential, and they always present. Some of them were here today, and some of them I've seen plenty, and others online. Michelle was here with us. And also, I'd like to thank our EXCO members. I mean, Dr. Padi Lihotla was here in the room. Joel Nechitenze is joining us online. And of course, our research team, and with the secretariat being Sipo Singiso is also here with us. Our sponsors, especially the anchor sponsors who've been supporting us from the beginning. But I'd like to make a special mention for those who supported us for this particular round, Anglo-American and ABSA, who've continued with their generous support even post-COVID, when we know that it's difficult times for corporates. Our PR agency that's very competent, they working with the technical team under the leadership of Funi. We thank you so much. Our partners, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and the HSRC that helped in actually getting the research papers together so that we bring in the logic to these creative insights. But the most important, our core participants and reference group members. Many of them are online. These are the people we interviewed. These are the people who helped us to discuss these things. All these insights are drawn from them. It's their gut feel, it's their instinct, because they are expert in their various fields. And they've continued with us on this long journey through FDA, like focus group discussions, ranking sessions, many workshops, and they still with us today. Would like to thank them because those are our key stakeholders. And with that said, we will then like to bring this session to Thank you, colleagues, and you may join us for lunch, and I know there's several interviews that have been scheduled. Thank you, and goodbye to those who are joining us virtually.